The story of the Second World War is filled with names that echo through history: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Buchenwald, but among them was a name less known, though no less haunting. Ravensbrück. It was a camp built for women. Between 1939 and 1945, more than 130,000 women and children were imprisoned there, from over 30 nations. Teachers, doctors, mothers, students, resistance fighters, stripped of their names, reduced to numbers. Some came from Poland, others from France, Norway, Ukraine, or Germany itself. Their crime was often nothing more than being the wrong race, faith, or opinion. The Nazis had built many places to break the human spirit, but in Ravensbrück, they sought to break the very idea of womanhood, to destroy compassion, dignity, and life-giving strength. And yet, within those barbed wires, in the darkest corners of history, many women refused to surrender that strength. They fought, with songs, with smuggled bread, with whispers of hope that could not be silenced. This is their story. Part I. Ravensbrück. The camp for women. Ravensbrück was built in 1939, about 50 miles north of Berlin, on the shores of a quiet lake surrounded by pine forests. The place looked peaceful from a distance, almost serene, but inside, it became a world of calculated cruelty. The camp was designed by Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, as the central camp for female prisoners. It began with just a few hundred inmates. By the war's end, it held more than 40,000 at once, packed into wooden barracks where disease, cold, and hunger ruled every day. Arrival trains arrived from all over occupied Europe. The women were unloaded into the biting wind, stripped naked, shaved, and forced into thin striped uniforms. Guards barked orders, dogs snapped at their heels. Each woman received a triangle badge that marked her identity: red for political prisoners, yellow for Jews, green for criminals, black for so-called asocials, prostitutes, lesbians, Roma, or those who simply didn't fit the Nazi ideal. Numbers replaced names, voices were forbidden, and for many, the journey into Ravensbrück was the last step before death. The SS women. The camp was unique not only because of its prisoners, but because of its guards. Ravensbrück trained more than 3,000 female SS officers, many of whom later served in other camps like Auschwitz and Majdanek. They were young, ordinary women, teachers, secretaries, housewives, who became instruments of terror. Their names became infamous: Dorothea Binz, Herta Oberhäuser, Irma Gries. They laughed as they beat prisoners, delighted in punishment, and treated pain as amusement. One survivor wrote later, they were worse than the men, because they wanted to prove they could be as cruel. Daily life. The day began before dawn with roll call, hours of standing in freezing cold, while guards counted and recounted the prisoners. Those who fainted were beaten. Those who died were left standing, their bodies propped up by others. After roll call came labor. The women were forced to work for German industries, sewing uniforms, repairing boots, building roads, even manufacturing weapons. Exhaustion was constant. Food consisted of watery soup and a scrap of bread. Disease spread quickly. Lice crawled through hair. Typhus and tuberculosis claimed hundreds every month. And yet, even here, some women found ways to resist. They hid medicine, shared crumbs, whispered prayers. In secret, they taught each other languages, poetry, and songs. These small acts became quiet rebellions against the system that sought to erase them. The Rabbits of Ravensbrück. In 1942, Himmler authorized medical experiments on prisoners, experiments that became some of the most grotesque in the war. Doctors, including Herta Oberhäuser, used young Polish women as test subjects for surgical experiments designed to study infections, bone transplants, and sterilization techniques. They were known as die Kaninchen, the rabbits. They were cut open without anesthesia, their legs mutilated, bones broken, and infected with gangrene. Some died from pain or infection. Those who survived were left crippled, yet even among them, resistance grew. The rabbits organized secret networks within the camp. They smuggled letters to the outside world, describing what was happening, and when the SS tried to execute them near the war's end, other prisoners hid them, risking their own lives. Their courage became legendary. After the war, many of these women testified at the Ravensbrück trials, ensuring that the world would hear the truth. Children in the camp Ravensbrück also held children, some born there, others brought with their mothers. Pregnant women were often forced into abortion, or their babies were taken away and left to die. Some mothers tried to hide their newborns under straw, feeding them secretly. A survivor later recalled, at night, we could hear babies crying from the infirmary. The next night, there were fewer cries. Of the thousands of children who entered Ravensbrück, Only a few hundred survived. Faith and friendship in a world designed to erase humanity. Friendship became salvation. Women from different countries learned to communicate through gestures, songs, or fragments of shared words. They formed secret circles of prayer, teaching, and hope. The French prisoners sang La Marseillaise quietly under their breath. The Polish whispered poems. The Norwegians knitted tiny flags from scraps of cloth, symbols of home. These moments did not defeat the Nazis, but they preserved something greater, the soul. The camp expands. By 1944, as the Reich began to fall, Ravensbrück grew even more overcrowded. Thousands of women from Auschwitz, evacuated camps, and death marches arrived each month. New barracks were built, but space ran out. Women slept in piles, shoulder to shoulder, on the floor. Typhus spread uncontrollably. The crematorium could no longer keep up with the bodies, so they dug mass graves in the forest. The final days. In early 1945, the sound of artillery grew louder. The Red Army was approaching. The SS began evacuating the camp, forcing tens of thousands of women onto death marches toward the west. Many collapsed in the snow. Those who couldn't walk were shot on the roadside. In late April 1945, Soviet forces reached Ravensbrück. The gates were opened. Only about 3,500 women were still alive. Some were too weak to stand, others smiled through tears, whispering the word they had not dared to say for years: freedom. Part 2. Women in Auschwitz-Birkenau. The gate of no return. When the trains arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the women inside had often spent days without food, water, or air, crammed into wooden cattle cars, hundreds at a time. They could barely breathe. The train would stop with a screech. SS guards shouted, "Raus! Schnell! Out! Quickly!" The doors opened to the blinding floodlights of the camp. Dogs barked. Soldiers pointed rifles. The smell, burning flesh, chemical smoke, hung in the air, and then came the selection. Dr. Joseph Mengele stood waiting, white gloves on, smiling politely as he moved his hand left or right. To the right, temporary life. To the left, the gas chambers. Women with children, the elderly, the sick, most went left. They never saw the sunrise again. Numbers instead of names. Those sent to the barracks were stripped naked, shaved, disinfected. Then came the tattoo, a blue number, burned into the flesh of the left arm. That number became their identity. "I stopped being a person that day," one survivor said. "I was just 75406. My name no longer mattered." Each woman received rags to wear, wooden clogs, and a tin bowl for food. Many never saw their families again. Life in Birkenau. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not just one camp, it was a universe of horror. It held over 200,000 women during the war, Jews, Poles, Romani, Russians, French, Hungarians, and others. They lived in wooden barracks meant for 40 horses but packed with 700 women each. The floors were mud. The air was thick with lice, smoke, and disease. Each day began with roll call at 4 a.m. Hours of standing motionless, even in snow or rain, while guards shouted and beat them for the smallest movement. After that, work, sorting the clothes of the dead, carrying stones, digging ditches, cleaning latrines. Every task was designed not just to exhaust the body, but to crush the soul. Food was a bowl of black water with a few potato skins. Hunger was constant, unending, merciless. "We dreamed of bread," wrote survivor Charlotte Delbo. "A crumb became a miracle." Hunger replaced every thought. The women's orchestra. Among the strangest tragedies of Auschwitz was the women's orchestra, led by Alma Rose, niece of composer Gustav Mahler. The orchestra was made of female prisoners who were ordered to play music as other prisoners marched to work and to the gas chambers. They played Schubert, marches, waltzes, while death unfolded just meters away. "We played as mothers and children walked by," one violinist recalled. "They smiled at us. They thought the music meant safety. But we knew." For some, the orchestra meant survival. The guards kept them alive for their talent. For others, it was a torment, a reminder that beauty could be forced to serve evil. Dr. Mengele's experiments. Auschwitz was also the domain of Dr. Joseph Mengele, known as the Angel of Death. He conducted experiments on women and children, especially twins. He studied eye color, sterilization, and genetic purity. He injected chemicals into eyes, performed surgeries without anesthesia, and killed simply to dissect afterward. One survivor described the children after his experiments. Their eyes were gone. Their little faces were gray. And yet they still tried to smile. Among the victims were hundreds of Roma women and children, whose entire families were exterminated in one night, August 2, 1944. Mothers and daughters. Perhaps the cruelest pain of Auschwitz was the separation of mothers and children. Guards tore babies from arms. They were sent directly to the gas chambers. Pregnant women were killed on site or used for sterilization experiments. Still, some mothers tried to save their children by lying about their age, by hiding them among the adults, by giving them stolen food at night. One mother, knowing her baby would be taken, gave the child to another prisoner and whispered, "If you survive, tell her I loved her." That prisoner survived, and the girl, decades later, learned who her mother was. Acts of resistance. Even here, surrounded by death, women fought back. In October 1944, a group of female prisoners working in the Sonderkommando, the units forced to operate the crematoria, smuggled gunpowder from the munitions factory. They blew up Crematorium 4, killing several SS guards. The ringleaders, Rosa Robota, Alla Gertner, Esther Wachblum, and Regina Safferstage, were caught, tortured, and hanged there. Last words were, "Be strong, and take revenge for us." They were 23 and 24 years old. The end approaches as the Red Army advanced. In January 1945, the SS began evacuating Auschwitz. Tens of thousands of women were forced on death marches through the snow. They walked barefoot, in rags, for hundreds of kilometers. Guards shot anyone who fell. Of the 60,000 who left Auschwitz, fewer than half survived the journey. On January 27, 1945, Soviet soldiers entered the camp. They found 7,000 women and children still alive, thin as shadows, eyes wide. They stared in silence as the soldiers opened the gates. One of them whispered, "Is it over?" The soldier nodded, but no one cheered. They were free, but they had left their lives behind in the ashes. Aftermath. After liberation, many survivors could not speak of what they had seen. Some returned home to find their families gone. Others were met with disbelief. No one could imagine what Auschwitz had truly been. But the women remembered. They wrote books, gave testimony, and taught generations what hatred can do when it wears a uniform. One of them, Charlotte Delbo, wrote, "You who live safe in your warm houses, remember that we were cold and hungry, and that you should never look away when another human being suffers." Part 3. Women in other camps. Ravensbrück Sisters. Majdanek. The camp of Wind and Ash. Majdanek stood near Lublin, Poland, open fields surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. Unlike the industrial precision of Auschwitz, Majdanek felt like something more primitive, more chaotic, yet just as lethal. Women sent there came from all corners of occupied Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union, and even France. Many had already been through ghettos or forced labor camps. By the time they arrived, they were hollow-eyed and skeletal, barely recognizable as human beings. They were forced to dig ditches, haul corpses, and wash soldiers' uniforms in freezing water. The cold bit through their bones. Lice and typhus spread faster than prayers. There was no mercy, not even in death. The crematorium never stopped burning. We slept beside the ashes of those who had been alive that morning. One survivor recalled, "You learned not to cry, because tears froze before they could fall." Majdanek also held women with children. Sometimes, the guards would play with the children, giving them candy, only to march them to the gas chambers moments later. The women learned to hide their faces, to protect their children's eyes from seeing too much. By the end of 1943, more than 78,000 people had perished in Majdanek, thousands of them women. Yet amid the despair, there were whispers of resistance. Polish women secretly taught language and history to the younger girls, scribbling lessons on scraps of cloth, hoping that if they died, the children would carry memory in their hearts. Bergen-Belsen. The swamp of the dying Bergen-Belsen was never built as an extermination camp, but by 1945, it had become a swamp of death. Located in northern Germany, it was originally a prisoner exchange camp, a place where hostages might be swapped for German prisoners abroad. But as the war turned against the Nazis, thousands of starving prisoners were crammed inside, and it became a nightmare beyond comprehension. The women of Bergen-Belsen came from Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and across occupied Europe. Among them were Anne Frank and her sister Margot, who died there in March 1945, just weeks before liberation. The camp was a landscape of rot. Bodies lay unburied, typhus and dysentery raged through the barracks. There was no food, no water, no medicine, only death. Survivors later said the smell was something you could not forget, something that stayed inside your lungs for life. "We didn't even bury the dead anymore," Said survivor Hannelore Brenner, there was no strength left. You just moved them aside to lie down. And yet, there were acts of humanity. Women shared crumbs of bread, whispered lullabies to dying children, held hands through the nights. In the midst of horror, they created fragments of love, of friendship, of faith. When the British Army liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, soldiers were struck silent. They found 60,000 living skeletons and more than 10,000 unburied corpses. Nurses wept as they tried to feed the survivors. For many, it was too late. Thousands died even after liberation, their bodies unable to process food after months of starvation. One British soldier wrote in his diary, "They looked at us with eyes that no longer belonged to this world." The Forgotten East, camps without names. While Auschwitz and Ravensbrück became infamous, the East was filled with hundreds of smaller camps, some without names, some without survivors. In occupied Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, women were imprisoned in forced labor colonies, burned alive in barns, or executed in forests. Entire villages of women and children were wiped out in reprisal for partisan activity. At Salaspils in Latvia, women were used for blood extraction experiments there. Blood drained to treat wounded German soldiers. In Kaunas, Lithuania, Jewish women were shot by the thousands beside the 9th Fort. In Babi Yar, near Kiev, women and children were machine-gunned in ravines, their bodies buried beneath the earth that still trembled for days. These were not camps built for imprisonment, they were open-air slaughterhouses, and because they left few witnesses, their stories faded into the soil of Eastern Europe. Female guards, the faces of cruelty. It would be easy to think only men committed the crimes. But in women's camps, some of the most feared figures were female SS guards, the Aufseherinnen. At Ravensbrück, Majdanek, and Auschwitz, these women oversaw torture, beatings, and selections. Names like Irma Gries, Herta Boda, and Maria Mandel became symbols of female brutality, young women who took pleasure in domination and death. Irma Gries, called the Beautiful Beast, carried a whip and a pistol. She beat prisoners to death for smiling, or for stumbling during roll call. She was only 22 when she was hanged after the war. Some historians have tried to explain them, saying they were products of ideology, or victims of indoctrination, but survivors remembered them simply as monsters. She was like a goddess of death, one woman said of Greece. Her smile was worse than her gun. The doctors and the experiments. Many women became victims of medical experiments designed to test sterilization methods, vaccines, or wound treatments. At Ravensbrück, Polish women, known later as the rabbits, were injected with bacteria, had bones broken and crushed, muscles removed, all in the name of Nazi science. Some survived by luck, others by the help of fellow prisoners who hid them from later executions. After the war, the survivors testified in Nuremberg, showing their scarred legs to the world. Their courage forced the world to face what had been done in the name of medicine. And their suffering led to the creation of modern medical ethics laws, the Nuremberg Code, forbidding human experimentation without consent, acts of sisterhood. Despite everything, the women built invisible webs of solidarity. They shared food, patched each other's wounds, whispered poems at night to keep the mind alive. In some camps, secret births occurred, mothers delivering babies under blankets, trying to keep them hidden for even one extra day of life. We had nothing, survivor Jedwiga Zido said, but we gave each other everything: courage, warmth, the will to live. In Ravensbrück, when one woman was beaten, others stood beside her. When one was taken for execution, someone whispered her name so she would not die forgotten. The final winter. Late 1944, the Nazi world was collapsing, the Allies were closing in, and the SS began evacuating camps. But evacuation meant death marches through snow and ice. Tens of thousands of women stumbled through Germany, barefoot, starving, guarded by soldiers who no longer believed in victory but still killed with the same cruelty. Some fell and were shot, others froze in ditches. A few were taken in by villagers or freed by advancing troops. In the chaos of those last months, humanity flickered like a dying candle, fragile, but never completely gone. The liberation in the spring of 1945, liberation came like a dream no one dared believe. The women saw tanks with white stars or red flags, soldiers who spoke strange languages, and for the first time in years, faces without hatred. At Ravensbrück, Soviet troops entered. On April 30, 1945. At Bergen-Belsen, the British arrived weeks earlier. They found living shadows, women weighing 30 kilograms, with eyes that had seen everything and could no longer weep. Doctors, nurses, and volunteers tried to help, but many survivors died in the first days of freedom. Their bodies had forgotten how to live. Still, for some, freedom was a rebirth. They wrote, they testified, they carried the stories of those who could not. Echoes after the war. The world struggled to understand. Many survivors were not believed. They were told to forget, to rebuild, to move on, but they refused. Silence. In Poland, France, Israel, and Germany, women began publishing memoirs. If this is a woman, I survived Ravensbrück, the women of Birkenau. Their words became monuments more enduring than stone. We survived, said survivor Margaret Buber-Newman, not to live for ourselves, but to be the voice of the ones who were silenced. Part 4, Liberation and Silence. The first days of freedom. When liberation came, it was not a moment of triumph, it was confusion, disbelief, and unbearable exhaustion. The women who had survived Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Majdanek were too weak to even rejoice. They blinked at the sunlight like creatures seeing it for the first time. In Bergen-Belsen, British soldiers walked through mountains of corpses and rows of starving women lying motionless in the mud. Some whispered, "Thank you," before dying in their rescuers' arms. At Ravensbrück, Soviet soldiers opened the gates and were met not with cheers, but silence. The women did not know if they were still prisoners, or if this was another cruel trick. They had seen guards disappear overnight, uniforms changed, hope itself had become something to fear. We were free, recalled survivor Olga Lengyel, but we were not alive. We were like ghosts who had forgotten how to breathe. The bodies remembered. The first task was survival, the next was remembering. Doctors from the Red Cross, the British Army, and the Soviet forces tried to nurse the survivors back to health, but the toll was unimaginable. Bodies broken by malnutrition, infection, and trauma often collapsed under the shock of food and medicine. For many, memory was as painful as hunger. The smell of bread triggered panic. The sight of a uniform made them tremble. Even laughter, after years of screams, felt dangerous. Those who lived carried invisible wounds, nightmares, trembling hands, and the haunting guilt of survival. Why me? Many asked. Why not her? It was a question without an answer. Returning home, to nowhere. For the women who tried to go home, there was often no home left. Cities were rubble, families gone, neighbors wary. Jewish survivors returned to Poland to find their houses occupied, their families murdered, and anti-Semitism still alive. Others, from France or the Netherlands, came home to governments that preferred silence. Nations ashamed to remember how collaboration had helped the occupiers. Some women were sent to displaced persons camps, run by the Allies. There they lived in tents or barracks, still behind barbed wire, though this time under a different flag. They waited for years, for papers, for ships, for someone to tell them where to go. A few emigrated to Israel, America, or Australia, determined to start anew. Others married, had children, and built lives upon the ashes. But deep inside, the camps never left them. I built a family, said one survivor, but I never left Ravensbrück. It lives behind my eyes. The trials of justice. After the war, the world sought justice, or tried to. At Nuremberg, the Nazi leadership was tried for crimes against humanity, but beyond those famous trials, there were dozens of smaller ones. In Hamburg, Dachau, and Warsaw, where the perpetrators of women's camps faced judgment. In the Ravensbrück trials, 1946 to 1948, female guards such as Dorothea Benz, Herta Oberhäuser, and others stood before the court. Survivors testified, sometimes fainting as they described the beatings, the medical experiments, the executions. One doctor, Herta Oberhäuser, had injected gasoline into prisoners' veins and removed flesh from living women. She was sentenced to 20 years, later released after 5. Irma Gries, the infamous Auschwitz guard, showed no remorse. She was executed by hanging at 22. Justice, for most survivors, felt partial and fragile. No punishment could balance the weight of what had been lost. They killed millions, one woman said. We could only hang a few. The math will never add up. Silence and shame. In the years that followed, silence became a second prison. The world wanted to move forward, to rebuild, to forget. Governments glorified resistance fighters but avoided speaking about the camps. Women survivors, in particular, were often ignored, their voices dismissed as too emotional or unreliable. Some were told by their husbands or families to keep quiet, to not bring back the past. Others were silenced by trauma itself, unable to speak, unable to sleep, afraid that words would make it real again. In some cultures, women felt shame for what had been done to them, the rape, the humiliation, the nakedness of survival. They buried their pain deep, raising children with haunted smiles, but silence could not last forever. The testimonies begin by the 1950s and 1960s. A new generation of survivors began to speak. Books appeared. I Survived Ravensbrück by Germaine Tillion, 5. Chimneys by Olga Lengyel, If This Is a Woman by Sarah Helm. Based on later research, each testimony cracked open the silence, revealing the hidden half of the Holocaust. The Women's Story. In classrooms and courts, in interviews and memorials, they began to tell the truth of hunger, motherhood, resistance, and endurance. We had no weapons, one said. Our strength was in staying human. These voices transformed history. They showed that women were not only victims, but also witnesses, fighters, and preservers of memory. Rebuilding identity. Survivors rebuilt themselves piece by piece. Some became writers, doctors, teachers, guardians of truth. Others chose quiet lives, holding their pain privately but passing it on through love and kindness. At the same time, many became activists. They campaigned for peace, for human rights, for justice for victims of later genocides. From there, trauma grew a new idea, never again, for anyone. That cry became the foundation of post-war humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions, and women's rights movements across the world. The second generation. The children of survivors, the second generation, inherited the silence and the shadows. They grew up with mothers who woke screaming at night, who hid food in cupboards, who wept when they smelled smoke. Many of these children later spoke of the invisible burden of survival. We were born from ashes, said one daughter of a Ravensbrück survivor. But our mothers taught us how to live with dignity. Through them, memory became a living chain, passed from heart to heart. Memorials and memory. In the decades that followed, memorials rose where barbed wire once stood. Auschwitz, Ravensbrück, Majdanek, and Bergen-Belsen became museums of remembrance. At Ravensbrück, survivors returned every year, laying flowers on the site where their friends had died. They spoke to schoolchildren, journalists, and politicians, their voices trembling but strong. We do not come here for hate, said survivor Teresa Mikskoska. We come so that the world will not forget what women endured when men lost their humanity. The legacy. The women's camps were not only places of horror, they were crucibles of human endurance. In them, women discovered a strength that defied the very idea of despair. They showed that compassion could exist even in the heart of evil. They became the silent architects of post-war conscience. Their testimonies reshaped history, forcing nations to look at themselves and ask, what happens when humanity is stripped away, and how do we rebuild it again? Epilogue. The strength of survival today. Fewer and fewer survivors remain, their numbers dwindle, but their stories burn brighter than ever. In the whispering wind of Ravensbrück, you can almost hear them, the voices of the women who refused to disappear. We were mothers, daughters, sisters. We were not soldiers, yet we fought. We were prisoners, yet we remained human. Remember us, not for how we died, but for how we lived. And that, perhaps, is their final victory. By early 1945, the world around the camps began to collapse. The echo of artillery thundered in the distance, growing closer each day. For years, the women of Ravensbrück, Auschwitz-Birkenau, and Majdanek had dreamed of freedom, but when it finally came, it was tangled with chaos, disbelief, and unbearable loss. As the Soviet army advanced from the east, the Nazis began evacuating their camps. The prisoners, frail shadows of humanity, were forced to march for miles in the freezing cold, the infamous death marches. Thousands of women stumbled through snow and mud, wearing only thin rags and wooden clogs. Those who fell behind were shot or left to die. The guards barked orders, terrified themselves of capture, while the women focused only on one thought: one more step, one more breath. At Ravensbrück, where over 50,000 women had perished, the final days were filled with dread. The crematorium smoked day and night. Trucks brought new prisoners, even as old ones were executed. The guards burned documents, destroyed records, and shot prisoners to hide the evidence of their crimes. Yet, amid the chaos, fragments of humanity appeared: a young nurse smuggling medicine, a guard secretly leaving bread by the fence, a prisoner whispering prayers for the dying. When Soviet troops finally reached Ravensbrück on April 30, 1945, they found horror beyond imagination. Emaciated women wandered like ghosts between piles of corpses. The air smelled of death and burned flesh. Some prisoners couldn't comprehend freedom. They had lived for so long in captivity that the open gate terrified them. Others fell to their knees, weeping silently, too weak to celebrate. At Auschwitz, liberation came earlier, January 27, 1945. The Red Army entered the camp to find about 7,000 prisoners alive, most of them women and children too sick to move. They found heaps of shoes, hair, glasses, and human ashes, silent witnesses of a genocide. Soviet cameramen filmed the scenes, but no footage could truly convey the scale of the suffering. Many of the women who survived Auschwitz never found their families again. They were alone in a world that had forgotten them. In Ravensbrück, the few who survived told their rescuers of experiments, torture, and murder. The Soviets gathered testimony, though much of it was lost in the political confusion that followed. Many of the female guards, the Aufseherin, were captured and tried. Some, like Irma Gries and Dorothea Binz, were sentenced to death at the Hamburg-Ravensbrück trials. Yet others vanished into the ruins of post-war Germany, never facing justice. For the survivors, liberation was not the end of suffering, it was the beginning of another kind of struggle. They had no homes to return to, no families waiting. Their bodies were broken, and their minds scarred. Many were haunted by nightmares of the camps for the rest of their lives. The world, eager to rebuild and forget, had little interest in their stories, but some refused silence. They began to speak, slowly, painfully, but with unbreakable courage. Women like Margaret Buber-Newman, Zofia Posmish, Luba Trzebinska, and Olga Lengyel wrote memoirs, testified in courts, and traveled across continents to tell what had happened. They spoke for the millions who could not. We were women without names, one survivor said, but we had souls that refused to die. Epilogue: the strength of survival. In the decades after the war, history began to uncover what had been hidden behind barbed wire. Ravensbrück, once just another German name, became a symbol of women's endurance. Museums and memorials rose from the ashes of the camps. Every year, survivors and their descendants return, laying flowers on the cracked concrete, whispering prayers for the sisters they lost. But the story of the women's camps is not only about death, it is also about defiance. In the face of unimaginable cruelty, these women held onto fragments of humanity. They shared their bread, risked their lives to help others, sang songs in the dark, and whispered hope into the ears of the dying. Even when stripped of everything, dignity, freedom, family, they found a way to remain human. The world learned slowly that the Holocaust was not only a crime against one people, but a wound to all humanity. The stories of the women of Ravensbrück and Auschwitz are threads in a vast tapestry of suffering and strength. Their voices, once silenced by terror, now echo across generations. When we hear them, in books, in testimonies, in the quiet hum of remembrance, we are reminded that evil thrives in silence. Memory is the only answer. The women of the camps did not survive for revenge, they survived so the world would never forget. I saw the darkness of mankind, one survivor said, but I also saw the light that refused to go out.